My mother's last letter had only 6 words. They changed my entire family. I was standing on a train platform at King's Cross when my father rang to tell me my mother had died. It was a Tuesday in March, the sort of grey, drizzling English Tuesday that makes the whole city look as though it's been photographed in black and white, and I remember every small, absurd detail of that moment with a clarity that still unsettles me: the smell of wet tarmac, the tinny announcement about a delayed service to Leeds, a pigeon pecking uselessly at a crushed paper cup near my feet, a man beside me arguing quietly into his phone about a missed invoice, entirely unaware that the world had just tilted a few degrees off its axis for the woman standing next to him. I had lived in London for 4 years by then, working for a small publishing house in Bloomsbury, telling myself that the distance between me and my family in Yorkshire was simply the ordinary cost of building a career, and not something I had, in some quieter corner of myself, chosen on purpose. "Emily," my father said, and I knew from the single syllable of my name, from the particular weight he put on it, that something was terribly wrong before he said another word. "Love, it's your mother." My mother, Margaret, had been unwell for some months. Her heart, the doctors in Harrogate had said vaguely, the sort of vagueness families accept because the alternative is too frightening to sit with properly. I had meant to go home. I had, in fact, looked at train tickets only the week before, told myself I would book them the following payday, and instead I had gone to the cinema with a colleague and eaten too much popcorn and thought about my mother for exactly as long as it takes an advertisement to finish before the film begins. I remember, with a shame that has not faded in 8 months, that I had actually considered ringing her that very evening and had decided, instead, that I was too tired, that I would ring her at the weekend when I had more to say. There was no weekend. She died that Tuesday afternoon, while I was standing on a platform in London, 200 miles away, worrying about whether I'd left the immersion heater on. I took the first train north the next morning. I do not remember very much of that journey, except that I cried somewhere past Peterborough, silently at first and then not silently at all, and the woman across the aisle, a kind stranger with a flask of tea and a paperback she never once opened, passed me a packet of tissues without asking why, and simply sat with me, saying nothing, which was somehow exactly the right thing to do. I have thought of her, oddly, more often than I might have expected, in the months since, a stranger who gave me the one kindness I could actually bear that morning, which was silence. The house in Harrogate felt wrong the moment I stepped through the gate. It was the same house I had grown up in, pale stone gone slightly grey with age, the same faded floral curtains my mother had hung herself back in the late 90s, the same apple tree in the back garden that never quite managed to fruit properly, the same crooked brass knocker shaped like a fox that had always stuck slightly if you turned it too quickly, and yet it had the peculiar, hollowed-out quality a house takes on the instant its center of gravity is removed. My mother had been the one who kept that house tethered to the earth. Without her moving through the rooms each morning, opening the curtains, arguing gently with the postman about a parcel gone astray, humming some half-remembered hymn while she watered the geraniums on the windowsill, the whole place seemed to list slightly, like a boat that has lost its ballast. My father, Robert, a retired schoolteacher with a soft voice and tired, gentle eyes, moved through those rooms like a man wading through water. He kept saying the wrong things to the wrong people, thanking mourners for their condolences with the automatic courtesy of a man who has not fully registered what he is being condoled about, offering biscuits twice to guests who had already declined, standing for long minutes in doorways as though he had forgotten which room he meant to enter. My older brother, James, had driven down from Edinburgh the same morning I'd come up from London, and he spent most of that week in the back garden, smoking cigarettes he thought none of us noticed, staring out at a sky that seemed determined to carry on exactly as normal, indifferent to our particular grief. Occasionally his wife, Claire, would come out and stand beside him without a word, and I would watch them from the kitchen window, two figures against a gray hedge, and feel, for reasons I could not fully explain, unbearably alone. The funeral itself passed in a blur of black umbrellas and hymns none of us could quite sing properly, of neighbors pressing casserole dishes into my father's unresisting hands, of the vicar saying kind, general things about a woman he had known for decades but perhaps never fully understood. None of us did, as it would turn out. I stood at the front of the small stone church in Harrogate, between my father and James, and I remember thinking, with the strange clarity grief sometimes grants you, that I had never once asked my mother a single serious question about her life before I was born. It had simply never occurred to me that there was a before, not really, not in any way that mattered. Parents, when you are young, seem to begin existing the moment you first become aware of them. I did not know, in that first week, that the house was still keeping one final secret from all three of us, a secret my mother had locked away, quite literally, in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, waiting for someone to be brave enough, or simply nosy enough, to go looking. That someone turned out to be me. It was the 4th day after the funeral. The visitors had finally thinned out, the endless casserole dishes left by well-meaning neighbors had finally stopped arriving, and the house had settled into the particular, ringing silence that follows a large loss once the crowd disperses and leaves the family alone with it. I went into my mother's study because I needed something to do with my hands. Grief without a task, I discovered that week, is almost unbearable. The mind, left idle, simply circles the same wound over and over, and so I told myself I was helping, that sorting her things was a service to my father, who could not bear to enter that room himself. Her writing desk still smelled faintly of lavender water and old paper, the smell of every letter she had ever written me at university, every birthday card, every small note tucked into a parcel of home-baked biscuits she used to post to my flat share in my first year of London. I sat on the floor in front of it for a long while before I opened a single drawer, some part of me understanding that once I began, I would be dismantling the last physical proof that she had lived in this room, that this had been her small, ordinary kingdom, ruled by fountain pens and a stamp collection she had inherited from her own father and never quite known what to do with. Eventually, I reached the bottom drawer, the one that had always, for as long as I could remember, been locked. As a child I had once asked her what was inside it, and she had smiled in that particular closed-off way she had, and said only, "Nothing you need worry about, love," and I had, being a child, believed her entirely and never asked again. I found the key taped, rather carelessly, beneath the drawer above it, and I remember thinking, even in my grief, that she had not hidden it particularly well. I wonder now whether some part of her had wanted it found. Inside, there were the sorts of things you would expect, photographs curling gently at their corners, a wedding order of service gone the color of weak tea, a stack of old Christmas cards tied with string, a lock of fair hair tied with blue ribbon that I would later learn was my own, saved from my very first haircut. There was a small chipped porcelain thimble that had belonged, I would later learn, to her own mother. And beneath all of it, in a plain white envelope with nothing written on the front, a single folded sheet of paper. I very nearly did not open it. I want to be honest about that. Some tired, grieving part of me thought, this is hers, this is private, whatever this is, it is not mine to read. But another part of me, the part that had spent 4 years in London, the part with 100 unanswered questions about my mother that I would now never get the chance to ask, had already unfolded it before I had properly decided to. 6 words. That was all it said. Find your sister. She needs you. I read those words perhaps a dozen times before they rearranged themselves into something resembling sense, and even then, they did not make any sense at all. I looked at the envelope again, turned it over, checked the drawer for anything further, some explanatory note, some second page, there was nothing. Just those 6 words, in my mother's careful, looping hand, the same hand that had written 1,000 shopping lists and birthday cards and love, Mum at the bottom of every letter she had ever sent me. I did not have a sister. To understand why 6 words could unmake an entire family in a single evening, you must first understand the shape of the family as I had always believed it to be. We were 4. My father, gentle and quietly devoted, prone to falling asleep in his armchair with the crossword still half finished on his lap, a man who had taught geography at the local comprehensive for 31 years and still, out of habit, corrected the pronunciation of place names on the news. My mother, who ran the household the way other people run companies, with lists pinned to the fridge, with an iron discipline that only occasionally cracked at its edges, revealing something softer beneath, something I had glimpsed only in odd, unguarded moments, the way she cried, always, during the King's Christmas broadcast, the way she kept a small framed photograph of a beach in Whitby on her bedside table, though we had, as far as I knew, never once been there as a family. My brother James, for years my senior, who had moved to Edinburgh in his mid-20s for work and rang home every Sunday evening with the practiced cheerfulness of a man performing wellness rather than feeling it, who had married Claire 5 years ago in a small register office wedding my mother had cried through from start to finish. And me, Emily, the younger one, the one who was somehow meant to be closest to home despite having put an entire country between us, the one who had always assumed there would be more time. There had never, in this arrangement, been a sister. I turned the words over and over that night, find your sister, she needs you, and every possible explanation I constructed collapsed beneath its own weight. I thought of every strange silence I had ever noticed growing up and never thought to question. My mother's peculiar stillness whenever the year 1994 came up in conversation, the way she would change the subject with a briskness that, at the time, I mistook for simple disinterest. The curious gap in our family photograph album between 1993 and 1995, a gap I had simply accepted the way children accept the frame of the stories they are given, without ever wondering what lay outside it. My grandmother, who had died when I was 9, and the strange expression she used to wear whilst looking at my mother, something like grief mixed with guilt, though I had no name for it then, something I had only ever filed away as the way grandma looks sometimes, a fact of the world rather than a clue to be pursued. And I thought of my Aunt Susan's words at the funeral, murmured quietly to no one in particular as she stood beside the grave, her hand resting on my father's arm. Her heart failed her many years before that. I had assumed, at the time, that she meant it figuratively, that grief and disappointment, accumulated over a lifetime, simply wear a person down. I understood now that she might have meant something far more literal. By morning I had decided 2 things. I would not tell my father or James, not yet, not until I understood more than nothing at all. And I would go and see Susan. Susan was my mother's younger sister by 6 years, and the only living relative of that generation who might know anything. She lived across town, in a narrow terraced house crowded with too many houseplants and too little light, a woman who had always struck me, in memory, as perpetually guarding herself against something the rest of us could not see, a woman who left family gatherings early, who deflected personal questions with a joke and a change of subject, who had never married and, when asked why, always gave a different answer depending on her mood. I went to her 2 days after the funeral, on the flimsy pretext of returning a cardigan she'd left behind at our house. We sat together in her cramped sitting room, drinking tea neither of us particularly wanted, surrounded by ferns and a small, ancient television that was never switched on, and I watched her hands, which trembled slightly on the teacup, though I could not tell whether it was age or something else entirely. "Auntie Sue," I said, "I found something in Mum's study." A letter. 6 words. Find your sister, she needs you. I don't have a sister. For a long moment, Susan said nothing at all. She looked past me, out towards the window, towards an apple tree that had not fruited properly in 3 years, and I watched something in her expression finally give way, the way a wall gives way to water it has held back for decades. She set her cup down with a hand that shook rather more than before. She was going to tell you herself, Susan said eventually. She told me, 3 years ago, sat in this very chair, that she meant to tell all of you. Properly, sit down, the whole story. Then she fell ill, and she kept saying, next year, when I am stronger. And then there wasn't a next year. Her voice caught. I told her, Emily, more than once, that she oughtn't wait. That there's never a good time for a thing like this, and putting it off only makes the eventual telling harder, not easier. She always said I didn't understand. Perhaps I didn't. Tell us what, Auntie? Susan set down her cup with great deliberation, as though the small act steadied her, and folded her hands in her lap the way I remembered her doing at family funerals and weddings alike, a woman who had spent a lifetime composing herself in rooms full of other people's feelings. Before she married your father, she said, your mother was married once before. I remember the particular quality of the silence that followed. Not shock, exactly, shock would arrive later, in slow, staggered waves, the way news of this size arrives in installments even after you have technically already heard it. What I felt in that first moment was closer to vertigo, the sensation of a floor tilting beneath a house I had assumed to be built on entirely solid ground. She was 19, Susan went on. It was a hasty registry office wedding, to a man called Derek Hargreaves, someone our father had business dealings with, a man he owed rather more than money, though I never learned the full particulars of that debt, and I don't think your mother did either, not fully. It lasted less than 2 years. He was cruel to her, Emily. Very cruel. I won't say more than that, because I don't think it's mine to say, and because your mother herself only ever spoke of it in the barest outline, even to me. And when she finally left him, when your grandfather finally, reluctantly, agreed she could leave, because in those days a woman didn't simply walk out of a marriage without her father's blessing, not in our family, not with Granddad's position at the church, she was already carrying a child. A daughter, I said, though I do not know how I knew, except that some quiet part of me had already understood it, the very moment I read those 6 words upon the page. Susan nodded. A daughter. Your mother wanted desperately to keep her. I remember her holding that baby in the hospital, Emily, just for a few days, and the way she looked at her, I have never forgotten it, not in 26 years. But in those days, and in our family especially, with your grandfather standing in the church and the whole business of respectability, the way people talked in a town this size, a divorced woman with an illegitimate child was considered scandalous. Your grandfather made the decision for her. The baby was given up for adoption through an agency in Manchester, quietly, quickly, before anyone in the congregation could count the months and do the arithmetic. Your mother was told it was the only way anyone would ever marry her again, the only way to salvage what remained of the family's reputation. She was 21, Emily. She had no power whatsoever to refuse. I don't believe she ever forgave our father for it, not properly, though she went to his funeral and wept and said all the right things, the way you do. I sat perfectly still, holding a teacup gone cold, trying to reconcile this new woman, this 19-year-old bride, this 21-year-old mother whose child was taken from her, with the woman I thought I had known my whole life. The woman who hummed while she gardened. The woman who wept, quietly, at the end of every Christmas because the house felt too silent once the guests had gone home, a fact I had always simply attributed to some general, unspecified nostalgia. The woman who, on the 15th of every single month, for reasons none of us had ever thought to question, sat by the window for exactly an hour and went quiet, and then returned to herself as though nothing at all had happened, so completely that we had all, over the years, simply stopped noticing it as strange at all. It had become, like the crooked fox knocker, simply part of the furniture of her. The 15th. My sister's birthday, I would later learn, a date I still cannot say aloud without my throat closing. Does she know? I asked. About us? About Mum? I don't know, Susan admitted. Your mother tried twice, across the years, to find her. Once when the girl was 12, the adoptive family refused to permit any contact, fearing it would upset the child, and I think, looking back, they were not entirely wrong to be cautious, though it broke your mother's heart at the time. Once again roughly 8 years ago, by which time the family had moved and the agency records had been reorganized under some new data protection law, and the trail went entirely cold. I believe, and here her voice cracked properly for the first time, not knowing what became of her was the wound that never truly closed. I think that is the real reason your mother's heart finally gave out, whatever the doctors wrote on the certificate. Some things do not heal, Emily. They only grow quieter. I did not go straight home. I sat outside Susan's house in the car for nearly an hour, engine off, watching that stubborn, fruitless apple tree through her front window, and I allowed myself to cry properly for the first time since the funeral, not merely for my mother's death, but for the entire hidden life she had carried alongside the one I thought I knew so well. A life with a daughter in it. A daughter she thought of, apparently, every 15th of every month, for 26 years, while I sat opposite her at the kitchen table discussing exam results and job interviews and, later, London flat shares and disappointing boyfriends, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was quietly carrying a grief the size of an entire person, sitting right there beside her at the table, invisible to the rest of us. That evening, I told my father. I had not planned to. I had promised myself I would wait until I had found this sister, until I understood the full shape of things before handing him a fragment that might break him further, a man already so unmoored by grief that I feared adding to it might genuinely undo him. But I found him in the sitting room, in his armchair, the crossword abandoned across his lap, 3 clues filled in and the rest left blank, and something about the defeated slope of his shoulders drew the words out of me before I could stop them. Dad, I said. Did you know Mum was married before you? He looked up slowly. In his face, in the peculiar, careful way his expression did not so much as flicker with surprise, I understood the answer before he spoke a single word. Yes, he said quietly. I knew. You knew about Sarah? His hands tightened, just slightly, on the arms of the chair. That was her name, he said, not a question, but a quiet confirmation, the confirmation of a man who has carried a fact alone for a very long time, turning it over and over in the dark like a stone worn smooth by handling. You knew, and you never told us. 26 years, Dad. You let us grow up without knowing we had a sister. It was not my story to tell, he said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only a tired, unguarded honesty, the sort that grief sometimes strips a person down to. It was your mother's. She asked me, before we married, sat in her own mother's kitchen, if you can believe it, terrified I'd change my mind, whether I could accept that this was part of her life, and I told her yes, of course, because I loved her, and because what had happened to her was never her shame to carry, whatever her father and the church elders believed at the time. But it was she who decided, year upon year, that the time had not yet come to tell you children. I respected that decision, though perhaps I ought not to have. Perhaps I only told myself it was respect when in truth it was simply easier, for both of us, to leave a locked drawer locked. She was trying to find her, I said. Before she died. Auntie Sue told me. My father closed his eyes. She told me too. 2 months before she passed, sitting up in bed one night when the pain was keeping her from sleep, she asked me to help her hire someone, a private tracer, the sort who specialize in these adoption reunions. I looked into it. There are proper professionals for it now, not like when she tried before. I told her we would do it together, once she'd grown stronger. I kept telling her that, week after week. I think, in the end, I believed it more than she did. His voice broke, and for the first time since my mother's death, I watched my father weep properly, not the composed, dignified grief of the funeral, but something rawer, something that had clearly been dammed up for years, if not decades, finally given permission to come apart. She left a letter, I said quietly. 6 words. Find your sister, she needs you. My father looked at me for a long moment, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture so familiar, so exactly like the way he used to wipe away my own tears when I was small, that it undid something in me all over again. Then I think, he said at last, that this is not finished. I think your mother left you the only thing she had left to give, not an answer, but a task. She is asking you to complete what she herself ran out of time to complete. James did not receive the news the way I had expected. I had imagined curiosity, perhaps caution, the way I myself had reacted. Instead, when I told him 2 days later, out in the back garden where he smoked his secret cigarettes, ash falling onto the damp grass below, his face closed like a slammed door. So what, he said, we're simply meant to accept this. A stranger appearing from nowhere, calling herself our sister? She hasn't appeared from nowhere, James. She has been out there her entire life. We are the ones who did not know she existed. That is not the point. He stubbed his cigarette out hard against the garden wall, though it was barely half finished, a habit he'd apparently taken up again this week after 4 years of claiming to have quit, something none of us had the heart to mention. The point is that Mum kept this from us for 26 years. The point is that Dad knew and said nothing. Everyone in this family, apparently, had a secret except you and me, and now Mum is dead, and instead of properly grieving her, we are meant to go digging up a story she clearly chose not to tell us, because if she had wanted us to know, Emily, she would have told us herself, while she was alive, rather than leaving us a riddle to solve after the fact, when it's convenient for absolutely no one. I understood his anger, even as it startled me. James had always been the practical one, the one who solved problems by containing them, by drawing tidy lines around what could be controlled and what could not, an accountant by training, a man who alphabetized his spice rack and reconciled his bank statements every Sunday evening without fail. A half-sister discovered posthumously through a cryptic letter was about as far outside his tidy lines as a thing could possibly get, and I could see, beneath the anger, something closer to panic, the panic of a man whose entire understanding of his family's shape had just been redrawn without his consent. She didn't leave us a riddle, I said, as gently as I could manage. She left us 6 words because she was dying and frightened and did not have the strength for more. I think, given another year, she would have told us everything herself, properly, the way Auntie Sue says she meant to. I think this letter was her last attempt, and she entrusted it to the only people left who might finish what she had started. James was quiet for a long while, staring out at the darkening garden, at the apple tree, at the fence he and Dad had mended together the summer he turned 16. When he finally spoke, his voice had lowered, the anger giving way to something closer to fear. What if we find her, he said, and she wants nothing at all to do with us? What if we go looking for this Sarah and discover she's built an entire life without ever knowing we existed, and she has no interest in a strange family turning up to rearrange everything she thought she understood about herself? Have you thought of that, Emily? We are not the only people this might hurt. There's her, whoever she's become. There's whatever family raised her, who might not thank us for turning up either. It was, I realized, a fair question, and a kinder one than his anger had first suggested. Beneath James's resistance was not indifference, but a particular, protective fear, the fear of causing further harm whilst attempting to mend something, the fear that our mother's dying wish might turn out to be a fresh wound rather than a healing, for a woman none of us had ever met, and for a family that had loved her for 28 years without our help. Perhaps, I said. But I don't believe that is our decision to make on her behalf. I think the only thing we can do is find her, tell her the truth gently, and allow her to decide what she wishes to do with it. That is more than Mum ever managed. I believe we owe her that much, Sarah, I mean. Not us. Her. James did not answer that evening. He went inside without a word, and I heard him and Claire talking quietly in their room for a long time afterwards, low voices through the wall, though I could not make out what was said. But 3 days later, without a word about it, he came with me to the address on Susan's old, faded letter from the adoption agency, a battered brown envelope she had kept folded inside a hymn book for decades, as though the Psalms themselves might keep it safe. We drove over to Manchester on a Thursday, the three of us, myself, James, and, rather to our surprise, our father, who insisted on coming despite James's worry that the journey would prove too much for him so soon after the funeral. I have spent 26 years allowing your mother to carry this alone in her heart, he said, in the tone that generally ended arguments in our house. I shall not be staying at home for this one. He sat in the back seat the entire journey, uncharacteristically silent, watching the motorway unspool past the window, and I caught his eyes in the rearview mirror once, red-rimmed and fixed on some middle distance none of the rest of us could see. The old agency letter, which Susan had kept folded inside a hymn book for decades, gave us the name of the adoptive family, the Bennets, and an address in Didsbury that turned out, after some confusion and a wrong turn or two down streets clearly redeveloped since the letter was written, to lead us to a neat semi-detached house with a rose bush by the front door and a hand-painted sign that read the Bennets in curling script, the sort of thing you buy from a craft fair. My heart was thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat as James knocked. The woman who answered was perhaps in her 60s, small, with sharp, tired eyes that studied the three of us with plain suspicion, a tea towel still slung over one shoulder, as though we had interrupted her mid-chore. When my father explained, haltingly, who we were and whom we sought, her expression shifted, not into welcome exactly, but into a wary recognition, as though she had long expected some version of this conversation and had quietly hoped it would never arrive, the way you hope a storm forecast for your part of the country might swerve at the last moment and miss you entirely. Sarah doesn't live here any longer, she said. Hasn't for 8 years. She moved down to London, of all places, for work. She said this with a strange bitterness, as though the coincidence that the daughter she had raised had unknowingly moved to the very city where I myself now lived, passing me perhaps on some tube platform or in some Sainsbury's queue without either of us knowing, was an injustice she had never quite made her peace with. You'd best come in, I suppose. Standing on the step won't do any of us any good. We sat in her small, immaculate front room, surrounded by photographs of a girl growing up, a gap-toothed 6-year-old on a bicycle, a gawky teenager in school uniform, a young woman in a graduation gown, none of whom, I realized with a jolt, I had ever seen before, and all of whom shared, unmistakably, my mother's particular arch of eyebrow. The woman, Sarah's adoptive mother, Diane Bennet, I understood now, The woman Susan had described as unable to have children of her own, made tea we barely touched and regarded each of us for a long moment, something in her expression softening, though not entirely. "She knows," Diane said quietly, setting the teapot down with a hand that trembled slightly. "About being adopted, I mean. We told her when she was 16. We always meant to tell her about her birth mother's name too, once she was ready, but she never asked, and I confess I never pushed the matter. I feared, I think, that if she knew too much, she would go looking, and then," she stopped herself abruptly, pressing her lips together. "I loved that girl as though she were my own flesh and blood. I love her still, every bit as much as if I'd carried her myself. I was frightened of losing her to a family that had once given her away, even though I always knew, deep down, that it wasn't your mother's choice to make. I knew that. I just didn't want to be the one to have to say it to Sarah, in case saying it made it real, in case it sent her looking for a door I couldn't follow her through. We are not here to take her from anyone," my father said gently, leaning forward, his hands folded between his knees. "We only wish to give her the chance to know the truth, should she want it. And to know that her mother, our Margaret, thought of her every single month for 26 years. That she never once stopped trying to find her way back to her, even when every door seemed shut." Diane's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. "Margaret," she said, testing the name upon her tongue as though she had heard it whispered once, long ago, by people who had believed she was not listening. "Yes. I remember that name. It was on the very first letter the agency sent us, all those years back, though we were told never to seek her out, and we honored that, we always honored that. I never once said it aloud in this house in 30 years, though I never forgot it either. I used to wonder about her, you know. Whether she was well. Whether she'd ever had other children. Whether she thought of Sarah the way I always suspected, hoped, really, that she might. She gave us an address in Clapham, a flat not 20 minutes from my own, and a telephone number, and before we left, something else besides, her blessing. Tell her gently," she said, standing at her front door as we prepared to leave, the rose bush trembling slightly in the wind beside her. "And tell her I always knew this day might come, and that whatever she decides, my door remains hers. It always shall. You tell her that from me. And tell her," her voice caught, "tell her I'm glad. Whatever else this stirs up, I am glad she gets to know she was wanted, twice over, by 2 different mothers, in 2 different ways. Not every child gets that. Most children only get to be wanted once." We did not go to Sarah's flat that same day. My father insisted, wisely I think now, that arriving unannounced, 3 strangers claiming to be family, would be its own particular cruelty, however good the intention behind it. Instead, I telephoned the number Diane had given us, 2 evenings later, sitting alone at my mother's writing desk with the 6-word letter propped against the lamp, my hands trembling so badly I had to dial it twice before I got the numbers right. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was quite unremarkable, a tired woman's voice, the voice of someone freshly returned home from a long day at work, a faint clatter of keys and a bag being set down audible in the background, and yet something about it did a strange thing to my chest, some instinctive recognition I could not properly explain, as though some part of me had been listening for that precise voice my entire life without ever knowing it. "Hello?" "Hello," I said, and then found I had no earthly idea how to go on, because there is no ordinary way to say what I needed to say. "My name is Emily. I'm ringing about, this is going to sound rather strange, and I promise I am not selling anything, nor attempting to scam you. I believe you might be my sister." A very long silence followed on the line. So long, in fact, that I thought she might simply hang up, and I found myself holding my breath, watching the second hand crawl round the small carriage clock on my mother's desk. "I think you have the wrong number," she said finally, though her voice had changed, had gone tight and careful in a way that told me she understood, on some level, exactly what I meant, even as she tried to deflect it. "Your name is Sarah," I said. "You grew up in Didsbury, with a family named Bennett. You were adopted as a baby. I spoke with your mother, your adoptive mother, Diane, only 2 days ago. She gave me your number, with her blessing." The silence that followed was different this time. Not confusion, but something quietly breaking open, and I heard what might have been a chair being pulled out, the sound of someone sitting down rather suddenly. "Why are you ringing me?" Sarah said, very softly, 28 years after I was given away. "Because our mother died recently," I said, my voice cracking on the word mother, on the strange, enormous weight of sharing that word with a stranger for the very first time. "And she left a letter." 6 words. "She asked us to find you." She never once stopped looking, Sarah. She tried twice before and could not manage it. "I know this is an impossible thing to accept over the telephone. But I would very much like to meet you. Whenever you feel ready. There is no pressure whatsoever. I simply have a sister I never knew existed, and she is out there, and I do not wish to lose the chance to know her, when our mother never got that same chance herself." I could hear Sarah weeping quietly on the other end of the line, attempting to hide it and failing entirely, the small catches of breath that give a person away even down a bad phone connection. "I used to imagine this," she said, after a while, her voice thick. "As a teenager, once they told me I had been adopted. I used to picture my birth mother arriving one day, explaining everything, telling me it had all been some dreadful mistake and that she wanted me back. Silly, really. I stopped imagining it eventually. Told myself it was a childish fantasy I needed to let go of, that dwelling on it wasn't fair to Mum and Dad, who'd given me everything. And now you are ringing to tell me she is already gone. That I missed her by mere weeks." 3 weeks, I said, and it felt like a blade, saying it so plainly. "I am so terribly sorry. I only found out myself 4 days ago." We were both weeping by then, 2 strangers on a telephone call, bound by a woman neither of us would ever get to introduce properly to the other, and yet somehow, impossibly, already bound to one another because of her. We met 3 days later, at a small cafe near Clapham Common, the sort of place with far too many hanging plants and a menu that took itself rather too seriously. I arrived first and sat facing the door, watching every woman who came through it, my heart in my throat each time, until finally a woman walked in and I knew, immediately, without needing a single word, that it was her. It was not that we looked precisely alike, we did not in the way people in films discover long-lost siblings and gasp at their mirrored faces. But there was something in the shape of her eyebrows, and the particular, slightly defensive way she held her shoulders, that felt so achingly familiar it caught in my throat, because I recognized it from every single photograph I had ever seen of my mother as a young woman. She sat down opposite me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. We simply looked at one another, 2 women who shared half a bloodline and an entire lifetime of separate history, trying to find some place at which to begin. "You have her eyebrows," I said at last, which was an odd thing to lead with, but it was the truest thing I could think to say. Sarah laughed, a startled, wet sort of laugh, somewhere between amusement and grief. "I always wondered where I'd got them from. My adoptive parents both have quite straight ones. Mine have always done this," she gestured at the slight arch, "the very same one I saw in the mirror on myself each morning, and nobody in my family could ever explain it. My dad used to joke I must have been swapped at the hospital. We talked for 4 hours that afternoon, long after our coffees had gone cold and the cafe had begun, gently, to hint at closing. I told her everything I knew, of our mother's first marriage, of the cruelty that had driven her to leave it, of the family pressure that took Sarah away before Margaret had even properly held her, of the 2 failed attempts to find her over the years, of the letter, the 6 words, the locked drawer in the writing desk. Sarah listened with an expression I could not entirely read, grief, certainly, but also something like relief, the relief of a person who has spent her whole life sensing a missing piece to her own story and finally being handed its shape, even if that shape was a sad one. I always felt it, she said at one point, staring down into her cold coffee, turning the cup slowly between her hands. Nothing specific. Simply an absence. As though there existed a room in my life I could somehow sense but never enter. My parents, my real parents, I mean, the ones who raised me, were wonderful. I want you to understand that. I had a happy childhood. I was loved, properly loved, no shortage of it. But there was always this quiet ache underneath everything, this sense that somewhere out there, someone was missing me the way I sometimes, secretly, missed her, even though I never met her, even though I did not know her name until this very afternoon. I used to think there was something wrong with me for feeling that way, given how much I already had. She missed you every 15th of the month, I said. My whole life, and she never once told me why. I always assumed it was simply one of those private sorrows adults carry without explanation. I never imagined it was you. Sarah reached across the table then and took my hand, the very first time we touched, and I felt something settle quietly in my chest that I had not realized was unsettled, an immediate, strange sense of belonging to this stranger, this woman who was, impossibly, my sister. Can I ask, she said, after a while, what she was like? Not the story of what happened to her. Just her. As a person. What did she smell like when you hugged her? What did she watch on the telly? Silly things. I've never had anyone to ask silly things like that. I told her. I told her about the geraniums on the windowsill, and the way our mother always burned the first pancake of any batch and gave it to the dog, even after the dog had died, simply out of habit, tossing it towards a spot on the kitchen floor where he used to sit. I told her about the King's Christmas broadcast, and the fox-shaped knocker that stuck, and the way she hummed hymns while gardening, though she rarely went to church except at Christmas and Easter. Sarah listened to every detail as though it were treasure, and in a way, I suppose it was, the only inheritance I had left to give her, freely, without complication, 28 years too late and yet somehow, still, exactly on time. I did not learn, until our second meeting the following week, that Sarah was engaged to a quiet, kind-eyed man named Tom, a structural engineer she had been with for 6 years, who came along to that second coffee at Sarah's request, sitting slightly apart at first, watching the two of us with the careful, protective attention of a man uncertain whether he was witnessing a joyful reunion or the sort of thing that might quietly unravel the woman he loved. I wanted him to hear it from you directly, Sarah explained, not filtered through me trying to explain it after the fact. It's been rather a lot to take in on my own. Tom shook my hand with a firm, careful grip, and said very little for the first half hour, though I noticed him watching Sarah's face throughout, gauging, I think, whether this was hurting her more than helping. It was only once I had told the story again, the letter, the 6 words, the locked drawer, that he finally spoke. I've known Sarah 6 years, he said quietly, and there's always been this, I don't quite know how to put it. This closed door somewhere in her. I used to think it was simply her nature, being a private person. But listening to you, I think I understand it rather better now. I think that door's been shut her whole life, and none of us, not even her mom and dad, quite knew what was behind it. I'm glad it's finally been opened. Even if it's difficult. Difficult is better than a locked door, I think. Sarah reached for his hand across the table, and I watched something pass between them, not relief exactly, but a kind of quiet gratitude, the gratitude of being finally, fully known by the person you love, missing pieces and all. We're to be married in the autumn, Sarah told me, a little shyly, as though testing whether this new, sudden family of hers would think it strange that she'd been planning a wedding without any of us knowing she existed. October. Nothing large. Just close friends, Tom's family, my mom and dad, obviously. She paused. I don't quite know what to do about all of you. Whether it would be too soon, or too strange, to ask. There's no timetable for this, I told her, though my chest ached at the thought of my mother, who would never see this wedding, who had spent 26 years imagining a daughter she might one day walk beside, and who had missed it, in the end, by mere weeks. Whatever feels right to you. We'll follow your lead. This is your life, Sarah, not ours to rearrange. She was quiet for a moment, and then, very softly, she said, I think I'd like you there. If your father would come too. And your brother. I know it's strange, asking near strangers to my own wedding. But you're not strangers, are you? Not really. Not anymore. It took a further fortnight before Sarah agreed to meet the rest of the family properly, all together, in Harrogate. James, who had been the most resistant of all of us at the outset, surprised everybody by weeping hardest of anyone when he finally shook her hand in our sitting room, the very same room where our mother used to sit each evening with her tea, the same room where the photograph album with its curious 1993 to 1995 gap still sat upon the shelf, waiting, I think now, for someone finally to fill in the missing pages. Claire had baked a cake, rather nervously, as though the occasion called for something and she hadn't known what else to offer, and it sat largely untouched on the table for the first hour, everyone too full of feeling to think of food. My father held Sarah's hands for a long while before he could bring himself to speak, and when he did, his voice was thick with feeling. I am sorry, he said, that it took us so terribly long. I am sorry your mother is not here to say this herself. But I want you to know, on the very day we married, she told me about you, and she told me she would never stop being your mother in her heart, whatever circumstance had forced her to do. She kept that promise, Sarah. I watched her keep it, quietly, for 26 years, even when none of us noticed. She used to sit by that window there, every 15th of the month, and I never once asked her why, and I have thought of little else since Emily explained it to me. I am sorry I never asked. I am sorry I let her carry it alone. We showed her the letter that afternoon, the 6 words that had begun this whole unraveling, and she held the paper for a long time, running her fingers gently over our mother's handwriting, a handwriting she had never once seen before and would now, I imagine, recognize for the rest of her life, in the shopping lists and birthday cards that still turned up occasionally in drawers around the house, small ordinary traces of a woman she would never get to properly meet. Find your sister, she read aloud, quietly. She needs you. She looked up, at me, at James, at our father, at Claire hovering anxiously by the cake, and her eyes were wet, though her voice remained steady. I think she got it slightly the wrong way round, actually. I think she meant it the other way too. I think all of you needed to find me, quite as much as she needed you to. Perhaps more. That same evening, we took her to the small churchyard on the edge of town where my mother was buried, the ground still bearing the raw, unsettled look of earth dug only weeks before, the headstone not yet arrived, only a small temporary marker with her name and dates upon it. Sarah knelt beside it for a long time, longer than any of the rest of us, and I do not know precisely what she said, for she said it quietly, to herself, in a language of grief belonging only to the two of them, the mother who never once stopped searching, and the daughter who had, impossibly, finally been found. When she rose, she was weeping, but she was also, unmistakably, smiling. "I forgive you," she said aloud, for all of us to hear, her voice carrying strangely in the still evening air. "I do hope you can hear me. I forgive you, and I am not angry, and I am here now. I am here." That first Christmas without my mother was also, strangely, the first Christmas with Sarah, and I have never quite known how to describe the peculiar tangle of grief and joy that ran through the whole day, the two feelings so tightly wound together that I could not always tell where one ended and the other began. We gathered at the house in Harrogate, my father, James and Claire, myself, and Sarah, who had asked, rather nervously, whether she might bring Tom and, separately, whether Diane and her husband might come too, just for an hour, if that wouldn't be too much. My father had said yes to both without a moment's hesitation, and so that Christmas afternoon, the sitting room held more people than it had in years, two families who had never expected to sit in the same room, brought together by a woman none of them could any longer thank in person. Diane arrived nervous, clutching a bottle of sherry she needn't have brought, and stood rather stiffly by the door until my father crossed the room and took both her hands in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for raising her so well. For loving her so completely. Whatever else this Christmas is, I want you to know it wouldn't exist at all without you." Diane wept, and so did I, and so, rather to his own visible surprise, did James, who had spent most of the autumn still faintly awkward around Sarah, unsure how to be a brother to a sister he'd known for less than a year, and who seemed, in that moment, to finally understand that awkwardness was allowed to simply be part of the process, that it needn't be resolved all at once. We ate too much, the way you do at Christmas, and at some point, quite without planning it, my father brought out the old photograph album, the one with the gap between 1993 and 1995, and set it on the table before Sarah. "There isn't anything of you in here," he said, a little sadly. "I wish there were. But perhaps we might start adding some now." And so we did, a photograph from that very afternoon, Sarah laughing at something James had said, tucked carefully into the first empty page after the gap, the beginning, I suppose, of a new album entirely, one that finally had room for everyone. Susan came too, later in the afternoon, and I watched her and Sarah sit together on the sofa for a long while, Susan telling stories about their mother as a young woman that none of the rest of us had ever heard, small, ordinary stories, the sort that only accumulate between sisters, about a girl who had once loved dancing before a cruel marriage taught her caution, who had wanted, before everything else happened to her, to become a schoolteacher like the man she would eventually marry. Sarah absorbed every word as though she were memorizing a language she'd been waiting her whole life to learn. Sarah and Tom married the following October, in a small stone church not unlike the one in Harrogate, surrounded by close friends, Tom's boisterous family, Diane and her husband, and, seated, at Sarah's particular insistence, in the second pew, just behind the parents of the groom, the four of us, my father, James and Claire, and me. I will admit I cried through most of the ceremony, and I was not the only one. There is something almost unbearably moving about watching a woman walk down an aisle towards a life she has chosen for herself, a woman who spent 28 years not knowing where she came from and who had, in the space of a single extraordinary year, gained an entire second family without losing an inch of the first. My father gave a small reading during the service, not something either family had originally planned, but Sarah had asked him herself, quietly, the week before, and he had wept while agreeing and then spent 3 days drafting and redrafting it at the kitchen table. He read a passage about love not requiring perfect timing, only the willingness to keep searching for what matters, however long it takes, and though he never once mentioned my mother by name during the reading, I do not think there was a single person in that church, family or otherwise, who did not understand exactly who he was speaking of. At the reception afterwards, in a marquee strung with fairy lights in Diane's own back garden, Sarah found me for a quiet moment away from the noise and the dancing, both of us slightly out of breath from an enthusiastic and largely unsuccessful attempt to teach Claire the steps to some dance James had insisted upon. "I keep thinking about her today," Sarah said, watching the lights sway gently overhead. "Not sadly, exactly. Just thinking about her. Wondering what she would have made of all this. Whether she would have liked Tom." "She would have adored him," I said, with more certainty than I perhaps had any right to, though I believed it entirely. "She always said the measure of a good man was whether he made the effort to learn your family's silly habits without being asked. Tom spent the whole evening trying to work out how to do the crossword the way Dad does, in pen, no corrections. She'd have loved that." Sarah laughed, wet-eyed, and put her arm through mine, and we stood together for a while longer, two sisters watching a wedding neither of us could quite believe was real, bound together by a woman who had run out of time to see it herself, but who had, in her own quiet, six-word way, made absolutely certain it would happen anyway. It has been 8 months since that grey Tuesday I stood upon a rain-soaked platform at King's Cross and learnt my mother had died. Since I sat upon the floor of her study and unfolded a single sheet of paper bearing 6 words. Our family looks rather different now than it did before, larger, more complicated, still finding its proper shape, the way a photograph slowly develops in the strange half-light of a darkroom. Sarah comes up to Harrogate for Sunday lunch most months now, and stays with me in London the rest of the time. We have, rather to both our surprise, become the sort of sisters who ring each other about nothing in particular on a Tuesday evening, who argue gently over which of us has inherited more of our mother's stubbornness, who have begun, slowly, to build the small shared vocabulary of jokes and references that I always assumed only grew between people who had known each other since childhood. She and James argue about football in a manner that makes my father laugh so hard he must leave the table entirely. Diane, the woman who raised her with such fierce, protective love, has become a sort of second aunt to me, someone I telephone now at Christmas, someone who wept the first time I called her simply Diane no longer, but Aunt Diane, without her ever having to ask. My father visits my mother's grave every Sunday after church, and now, sometimes, Sarah goes along with him. He says it is the only hour of the whole week he feels close to whole again, sitting beside the daughter Margaret never got the chance to raise, at the grave of the mother that same daughter never got the chance to properly know, the three of them, in a strange and unrepeatable fashion, finally together. The headstone arrived in the spring, plain grey granite with her name and dates, and beneath them, at my father's own insistence, a single line he chose himself: "She never stopped looking for what she loved." I think of the letter often, in idle moments, on trains, in the small grey hours before sleep. 6 words, written by a dying woman who had not the strength left for more, who perhaps believed, in her final weeks, that she was leaving us an impossible task, a wound with no bandage, a debt she would die still owing. I do not believe that any longer. I believe my mother understood something, in those final weeks, that she could not have understood at any earlier point in her life, that love, real love, does not require you to mend everything entirely by yourself. Sometimes it requires only that you point, clearly and honestly, towards the thing that still needs mending, and trust the people who love you to finish what you began. Find your sister. She needs you. She was quite right, of course, though I do not think even she fully understood, when she wrote those 6 words with what little strength remained to her, precisely how true they would prove to be, not only that Sarah needed us, though she did, in the quiet way that anyone carrying an unanswered question about their own beginning needs an answer, but that we needed her equally. That our family, which I had always believed complete, had in fact been carrying an absence for 26 years, a shape of a person missing from every family photograph, every Christmas dinner, every ordinary Tuesday, and none of us had known to grieve it properly until the day we found her and understood, all at once, precisely what we had been missing. My mother left this world with a hole in her heart the exact size and shape of her firstborn daughter. In her final 6 words, she did not attempt to close that hole herself. She simply told the rest of us where to find the missing piece, and trusted that we would carry it safely home. We did. I believe, wherever she is now, that she finally knows it.